Unfortunately, not every boy who grows up actually becomes a man, because not all adult men develop equally. And right now, the gap between a man and an underdeveloped man is wider than we've ever seen. There are more men walking around today who look like adults but function like children, with no structure, no accountability, no discipline, no follow-through, just potential, excuses, and a constant need for comfort. And instead of calling it what it actually is, we as a culture rationalize it and make excuses like, he's just figuring it out. But what if the issue is that he was never required to become a man in the first place? This gives us information about what we're doing societally that is creating this type of men. Because men don't end up this way because they're incapable. They end up this way because their environment never demanded growth. They were conditioned to be soft. And while hearing this might make you uncomfortable, there are a lot of grown men living in adult bodies who never developed into the men they needed to be, and it is wreaking havoc on families and relationships. And part of the problem is that we keep participating in this dynamic. We excuse it, we tolerate it, and sometimes we even enable it. So this message isn't just for men to understand themselves better. This message is also for women, because we play a role in this conditioning too. The important thing to keep in mind is that this kind of man is not incapable. He is just underdeveloped. And if relationship problems related to this dynamic keep showing up, we can't keep avoiding this conversation. So, instead of dismissing it, let's talk about it, starting with a concrete definition of what kind of man I'm talking about. So when I say a man never grew up, I don't mean that he's immature like in the casual sense of being playful and joking. What I mean is that he never developed the structure that is required of him to lead his own life or the lives of others, like spouses and children. I'm talking about someone who avoids responsibility instead of taking ownership, someone who procrastinates, has a poor work ethic, lacks standards, is irresponsible with money, treats his partners like parental figures, depends on others emotionally instead of learning how to regulate himself, someone who wants outcomes and has big dreams but fails to commit to the process of making those dreams come true. This person struggles with discipline, consistency, and follow-through, defaults to blame and withdraws, makes excuses when things get hard. This is also someone who is passive and rarely takes initiative. Okay, I think we all get the point. Because it is so prevalent, I'm pretty sure that we all have an idea of the type of man that I'm talking about. Growth into manhood is not automatic, because at minimum, it requires these three things. A separation from dependency, so learning to stand on their own without needing someone else to hold their hand through it. Number two, exposure to responsibility and consequence. So this is being held accountable for their choices and feeling the weight and consequence of those choices. And number three, the development of identity independent of external validation. So this is knowing who you are without needing that constant approval to confirm it from others. When that process gets interrupted, you actually end up with someone who is not only developmentally stuck, you get someone who looks for others to carry what they've never learned. So this is someone who avoids pressure instead of rising to it. Someone who wants big things in life without becoming the man required to sustain it. And then over time, that doesn't just create stagnation. It creates dependency, entitlement, and a pattern of avoiding responsibility while expecting all of the benefits. So instead of growing into the man he envisioned for himself, he becomes complacent with just staying the same. Now, let's tackle the question of what kind of environment produces this outcome, because I am telling you, it does not happen randomly. It is not just his personality. The thing is, while this might not be the norm for all men, it is increasingly more common in society today than it was even just 20 years ago. There was a time when boys were expected to contribute, to work, to carry responsibility, and be part of something that required them to show up and follow through and be accountable, and do it consistently enough that those traits actually developed in them. They weren't protected from pressure, and because of that, responsibility was something that they were already familiar with as they entered adulthood. However, as society has evolved and more women have entered the workforce, the entire structure of families has completely changed. More and more mothers are working outside the home. There are more single-parent households than ever before. There is more pressure on one parent, usually women, to carry the weight of everything: children, household, and work. And that means that more children are growing up without any consistent structure in their lives. And while that shift undoubtedly created more opportunities for women, it also changed the conditions that help shape a child's development. And that's what we're talking about. Because that societal shift is critical to understanding how we have a society full of underdeveloped men, because it begins at home with how we parent young boys. Let me explain. So first, let's talk about parenting styles. So first, we're going to talk about permissive parenting, because permissive parenting is where there are very few actual consequences and where behavior is inconsistently corrected. So without consequence, a child never understands or learns to understand that their actions actually carry weight. So responsibility with this kind of parenting style never fully develops. And then we have this second type of parenting, which is the overprotective parent. And this is where parents just step in way too quickly. They are uncomfortable, so they remove the struggle that the child is going through. They might solve problems for the child. And all of this is coming from care and concern. But it also prevents autonomy. So it hinders the kid from ever being able to actually figure things out on their own. It hinders them from being able to fail or to build confidence through their experiences. And without that confidence building, you don't get capability. You actually build an unhealthy dependence on others. But on top of parenting, let's add the next layer where both parents are working and the child's time is actually spent in the care of caregivers or in structured environments like school or after-school sports. But those structured environments aren't focused on developing any life skills. So when parents do get time with their kids, what do the parents naturally want to do? They want to connect with their kids. They want quality time and emotional closeness, which I'm not diminishing the significance of that, but it comes at the expense of competence and practical skills and responsibility and discipline. the things that actually prepare a child to enter adulthood productively. Because connection without any expectation might create comfort for the child, but fails to provide growth. And I am telling you, comfort does not build men. It builds dependency. And don't think for a minute that this won't carry over into their adult relationships. We also have enmeshment. So instead of being required to grow up and contribute in a healthy way to society and to family and develop a desire actually to take on responsibilities, the child becomes needed by the parent instead. So this shows up when the child becomes the one that the mom vents to, or is the one who comforts her, or is the one who understands what she's going through. The child is being treated like a partner instead of a child. And on the surface, sometimes this can look like maturity, but it is not, because they're not developing their own identity. They're developing attachment. And while this might not be intentional, this is what happens when a mother is carrying too much alone and lacks relationships where her needs aren't being met. Essentially, it's a form of like role reversal when the child begins to meet the parent's emotional needs rather than the parent being this stable foundation for the child. And this is where development gets disrupted, because for a boy to become a man, he has to separate. He has to develop independence and form his own identity and learn to stand on his own. But if his role in his family is simply to stay close and needed and emotionally connected to his mom, then separation just feels like abandonment to him. So in order to maintain that connection, he might stay attached, but he never becomes his own unique person. You guys, that is enmeshment. And when a boy is rewarded for being emotionally available to his mother, but never required to take on any responsibility for himself or for others, he grows into a man who might know how to feel, but has no clue how to lead his own life. And then lastly, let's talk about the lack of a masculine model in these single-parent households. When enmeshment is combined with the absence of a masculine presence in the household, so this is someone who is able to model structure, discipline, and accountability, there is actually zero template for that boy to follow. There is no example of what it actually means to be a man, what is expected of him, and how to become someone capable of leading his own life and gain the worthiness to lead a family. And without that, he's left to figure it out on his own. Often, though, what we see is that many of these boys simply avoid it altogether. And this template of masculinity used to not only fall on one person alone. This wasn't only the responsibility of dad. Masculine development used to be reinforced at multiple levels. So not just by fathers, but by mentors and leaders and men in the community who modeled what that meant to carry responsibility. So boys weren't just hearing what was expected of them, they actually saw it. They experienced it. They were shaped by it. Boys learn through modeling and emulation. They don't just need to be told who to become. They need to see it lived out in front of them. And when that model is missing, they don't ever get the chance to develop a clear sense of identity and responsibility, values, morals, standards, and purpose, or what it actually means to earn respect for themselves and from others. So instead of growing into a man with direction and standards, this boy grows into someone who is still searching for those things. And when you put all of that together, the parenting, the environment, the lack of structure, the lack of modeling, you can actually start to see the pattern of all the areas where this boy is underdeveloped. And then those same patterns follow them into adulthood with their partners. But just because this development didn't happen when it was supposed to, does not mean it can't happen at all. But it does mean it won't happen automatically. And it won't happen just because somebody understands their past. This development happens when a man decides consciously to take responsibility for the parts of himself that were never developed, to build the structure where there wasn't any, to create discipline where it was never required, to face pressure instead of avoiding it. Because at some point, what you weren't taught might not be your fault, but it is 100% absolutely your responsibility. At the end of the day, you don't become a man because of your upbringing. You become a man when you choose consciously to develop yourself regardless of what happened in your upbringing. And that's the part most people don't want to hear, because it's so much easier to stay in this story of, I didn't have the right environment, I wasn't shown how, I never learned. And while all of that might be true, it doesn't change a thing about what's required now in your current relationships. You can stay the product of your environment, and many people do. Or you can choose consciously to become the man who outgrew your circumstances. And before we close, for the women who are watching this, understanding this dynamic does not mean you have to tolerate it. My hope is that understanding this will help you recognize what you're actually dealing with, so that you can stop confusing this idea of their potential and just wanting them to change with what they are actually willing and ready to change. Because no matter what we do, we cannot force somebody into this role. They have to make that decision.